Welcome to Alien Shadow. If you love epic sci-fi stories where humanity shines, you're in the right place. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for thrilling HFY adventures. Join us and be part of the journey. The last day before departure, the cargo ship Iron Hope floated in the outer ring of the Valor system, silent and waiting. Captain Mark Hollis was loading crates into the storage bay, thinking about dinner and the long flight ahead. He moved like a man who had done this job 100 times. Careful, bored, but that day would not be like the others. When he opened one of the last storage containers, he froze. Inside, curled up under a thin thermal blanket, was a girl. Alien girl with gray-blue skin and glowing green eyes. She looked up at him with fear, then determination, and before he could speak, she blurted out, "I'm practically an adult human." Mark stepped back in shock, nearly dropping his scanner. The girl scrambled to her knees, wobbling slightly as if she hadn't eaten in days. She wore an oversized flight jacket, clearly stolen, and her feet were bare and dirty. "I'm not a child," she added, her voice shaking but firm. Mark stared at her, trying to understand what was happening. This was no ordinary stowaway. She had markings on her neck that belonged to the Zachary species, a species currently at war with its own government. "You're from Corvin 9, aren't you?" Mark asked quietly. The girl hesitated, then nodded. "My name is Jerry," she said. "My colony is gone, burned. I escaped during the last attack. I just wanted somewhere safe." Mark rubbed his forehead, glancing at the control panel behind him. Harboring a Zachary fugitive could get him arrested, fined, or worse, but she looked so small, so determined, sitting there trying to look grown up. He sighed and helped her out of the container. She followed him like a shadow, quiet and careful. He gave her protein packs and water, which she devoured. In seconds he could see the hunger in her eyes, the way her hands shook as she ate. "Snorts just one night," he muttered, more to himself than to her. That night Jerry sat in the corner of the cockpit while Mark adjusted. Then of roots she watched him with wide eyes, sometimes asking simple questions about the ship. He answered them slowly, warming to her presence. There was something honest about her. Snort's curiosity. When the engines cooled and the lights dimmed, Mark gave her his cot and sat in the pilot seat. She looked at the stars through the window and whispered, "It's quiet here, quieter than war." He replied. She was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Why did you let me stay?" Mark looked at her and shrugged. "Because you reminded me of someone," he said. "Someone who didn't get a second chance." The next morning Mark woke early and checked his messages. He had already received a warning from the port authority. A Zachary escape was being hunted in this sector. He knew it was time to drop her off before someone else found her. He took her to a neutral refugee station orbiting a gas giant. The place was crowded with aliens of all kinds, all running from something. Jerry didn't complain, didn't cry. She just looked up at him with those glowing eyes. "Thank you, Captain," she said quietly. Mark handed her a pouch with extra rations and a worn chip. "If you ever need help again," he said, "use this. If I'm alive, I'll answer." She nodded, her face serious beyond her ears. She turned to walk away, but then stopped and looked back. "I'll come back one day," she said, "when I'm grown." Mark smiled a little. "You've already seemed grown to me." Snort's Jerry opened her mouth to say something else, then Closed it, she gave a small wave, then disappeared into the crowd. Mark watched her until she vanished. He felt a strange weight in his chest, like he'd just seen something important slip away. The engines of Iron Hope roared back to life as he rose into the stars. Snorts. He whispered, "Stay safe, Jerry." He didn't know then, but she would keep her promise, and when she returned, the galaxy would never be the same again. A war-torn galaxy. 6 years had passed since Jerry stepped off the Iron Hope and vanished into the refugee crowds. Captain Mark Hollis often wondered what happened to her. He told himself she was safe, that she found a good place to grow up, but he knew the galaxy didn't give happy endings for free. The Valor Belt was now crawling with rebel groups, slavers and private militias. Jerry's home planet Corvin had fallen into civil war. The Galactic Council had pulled out, declaring the region too unstable, and people like Mark were left to pick up the broken pieces. Mark had changed too. He was no longer just a cargo pilot. He had become a smuggler of medicine, a transporter of refugees, and sometimes a rescuer, not for glory but because no one else would do it. One stormy night, Mark took a risky job to deliver medical supplies to a mining colony. As he flew low over a frozen moon, pirates attacked his ship. Laser fire tore through the hull and the engines died midair. The Iron Hope spun out of control and crashed hard into the ice. Mark woke up with blood on his forehead and sparks raining down from the ceiling. The cockpit was smashed. Communications were offline and oxygen levels were dropping. He stumbled outside into the snow, wrapped in a thermal blanket. No one was coming for him, he thought. This time he wouldn't get out alive. He built a shelter from wreckage and activated a weak distress beacon. Every few hours he would check the beacon and the oxygen tank. Each time the numbers got worse. Then something strange happened. A hot flask of broth appeared beside him while he slept. The next night someone repaired the broken heater inside the shelter. He never saw them, only heard faint footsteps in the snow. He thought he was hallucinating until the third day. That day a shadow approached while he was outside gathering metal scraps. Mark turned quickly, pointing his emergency flare like a weapon. The figure wore a battle cloak, a mask with silver markings, and held no weapon. The person said nothing, only handed him a small container of real food. The voice was calm and female. "You shouldn't point that at me, Captain Hollis," she said. Mark froze as the voice echoed his ears. He knew that voice. "Jerry," he whispered, unsure if his mind was playing tricks. The figure nodded slowly and pulled off the mask. Her face was older, sharper, marked with tiny scars and a tattoo on her jawline, but those green glowing eyes had never changed. Mark nearly collapsed from shock and relief. She caught him gently and helped him sit. "You're alive," he said, still in disbelief. "I came back," she replied softly, "like I said I would." He looked at her armor, worn and cracked symbols of a rebel group he'd only heard rumors about. Decorated her shoulder pad. "You're part of the scary resistance now," he said, more a statement than a question. Jerry nodded, her eyes scanning the sky. "There's something worse coming," she said, "and you need to know about it." Mark wanted to ask more, but his body was weak. Jerry carried him back into the shelter and reconnected parts of his ship's life support manually. She worked with speed and focus, not like a scared teen, but like a trained Soldier, later that night Mark sat across from her by the dim firelight. He looked at the young woman who had once been a scared girl hiding in his cargo hold. Now she moved like a warrior, spoke like a leader, but there was still a quiet warmth in her voice when she spoke to him. "I've been watching," she said, "following your missions, your rescues. You inspired more than you know." Captain Mark laughed weakly. "I'm just a guy with a rusty ship. You were the first person who didn't see me as a burden," she replied. "That changed me." Before he could reply, a beeping sound echoed from her wrist device. Snorts. She stood quickly, her face serious. "Again, my team is nearby, and I need to go," she said, "but I'll come back for you tomorrow. There's a lot you need to hear." Mark watched her disappear into the snow, her figure swallowed by wind and night. He leaned back, eyes wide open, breath short. She had come back, but she hadn't returned just for memories. She had returned with a mission, the warrior in the mask. The night was long, and Captain Mark Hollis couldn't sleep, even though the shelter was warmer now and the air tanks were stable. His mind was racing with thoughts of Jur, how much she had changed, and why she had returned now. He sat near the small heater, holding a cracked mug of broth she had brought. Steam rose into the frozen air, but his hands trembled, not from the cold, but from something deeper, from the memory of a girl who once said, "I'm practically an adult human." She was no girl now. That much was clear. She moved like a soldier, spoke like a leader, and yet, when she looked at him, there was still something soft beneath her eyes. Next evening, Jiri returned. She entered silently, stepping through the snow as if it obeyed her. Her mask was back on, hiding her face, but Mark could feel the same presence, sharp, alert, familiar. "You're early," he said, forcing a smile. She didn't answer at first, just pulled off the mask and sat across from him. "I found something," she said, "and I need to show you." Mark sat up straighter. Sensing this wasn't small, she activated a small hollow device on her wrist. A map of her home planet, Corvinine, shimmered into view. Lines, dots, and blinking markers showed military bases, mining colonies, and something massive. A glowing red symbol pulsed near the northern continent. "That's a weapon site," Juri explained. "Something left behind by the first dynasties. The scary government wants to activate it to wipe out rebel sectors and any human outposts nearby." Mark's eyes narrowed. "They're going to commit genocide," he said quietly. Jerry nodded slowly. "Unless we stop them before activation," she replied. Mark stood and paced, trying to make sense of it all. "You want me to help stop a planet killer?" he asked. "You're not just a pilot anymore," she said. "You've helped more people than most fleets combined." Mark paused, looking at the woman before him. "I still see the kid in my ship's engine room chewing protein bars," he muttered. She smiled faintly. "And I still see the man who gave me a bed and didn't call the guards." A quiet moment passed between them. Then Juri took a breath and said something that made him freeze. "I want you to meet my team," she said. "Tonight." Mark blinked. "They're here on this moon. They followed my signal," she said, "and they trust me, which means they'll need to trust you too." Mark hesitated, then nodded. "If I'm doing this, I need to know everything," he said. Jerry stood and extended her hand. "Then come with me, Captain," she said. "You've walked enough paths alone." Mark grabbed his jacket, checked his weapon, and followed her out into the snow. The storm had settled into a slow wind, cutting through the night like breath on glass. They walked side by side, wordless until lights flickered in the distance, a camp hidden under camouflage netting and surrounded by scanners. Appeared figures in cloaks and armor. Turned as Jerry approached, she raised her hand and they lowered their weapons. "This is Mark Hollis," she said simply. "He's with me," murmurs passed through the crowd. Some recognized his name. Others stared with suspicion. A tall female with cybernetic arms stepped forward. "I've heard of you," she said. "The human who smuggled food past the Eric blockade." Mark shrugged. "I was hungry too," he said, earning a few laughs. Jerry led him to a table covered in maps, notes and energy cell packs. "We call the mission Operation Duskfall," she said, pointing to the weapon sight on the display. "We infiltrate, sabotage the control core, and erase the targeting sequence." Mark studied the plan, noting gaps, risks, and fail points. "This will get you all killed," he said bluntly, "unless someone flies you in under stealth." Jerry raised an eyebrow. "You volunteering?" He grinned, didn't say no. That night, Mark sat beside the campfire, staring into the flames. He had flown through war zones, escaped bounty hunters, and crossed dead sectors, but nothing felt as real as this. As the cold wind howled above, he glanced at Jerry across the fire. She was talking to her crew, confident and respected, yet when her eyes met his, they softened for just a second. He didn't know what she saw in him. Maybe the past, maybe trust, but he knew one thing for sure: this wasn't the end of their story. It was only the beginning of something far greater. Operation Dusk, Rebel Camp buzzed with quiet urgency as morning light touched the frozen moon. Mark Hollis stood near the Iron Hope, now half repaired and fitted with stealth plating. He hadn't flown her into battle in years, but something about this mission lit a fire in his chest. Maybe it was the Kaiser. Maybe it was the girl who returned as a warrior. Jerry stood across from him, giving orders to her squad with precision. Her voice was calm, her posture unshaken. Mark couldn't help but watch her and wonder how much pain she'd survived to become this strong. She caught him staring and walked over, handing him a small data ship flight path. She said, "Get us through undetected and we'll handle the rest." Mark glanced at the chip and then at her. "And if we're detected?" he asked. Jerry didn't blink. "Then we fight until we can't." Mark smiled faintly. "You really did grow up." She raised an eyebrow. "You thought I wouldn't?" He shrugged. "I thought maybe the galaxy would crush that spark first." Jerry's voice softened. "You were the reason it didn't inside the ship." Mark ran checks while her squad loaded gear. Silently, there was a tension in the air, not fear but the weight of knowing this mission could be their last. Jerry sat beside him in the cockpit, both of them strapped in and focused. "Engines hot," Mark said, fingers dancing over controls. She nodded. "Let's make history." The ship lifted off with a low hum, vanishing into the dark sky like a shadow. Mark guided the Iron Hope along the edge of an asteroid field, dodging sensors and gravity mines. They flew complete silence, every second heavy with risk. An alert pinged in Mark's hand, snapped to the side console. "Patrol ship 2 clicks out," he whispered. Jerry leaned forward. "Divert." Now he twisted the controls. The ship dipped below the asteroid shelf, just missing detection. The patrol ship passed, blind to their presence. Jerry let out a slow breath. "Nice flying." Mark grinned. "Still got it," she Smirked, "You better." Hours passed until the weapon site came into view, massive. Black facility buried into a mountain. It pulsed with energy, and even from a distance they could feel the vibration. Jerry's team suited up, their armor marked with rebel insignias and personal symbols. Mark watched them quietly, knowing half of them might not return. "You're staying with the ship, right?" Jerry asked him. He nodded. "I'll keep it hot in case you need an emergency pull out." She paused, then stepped closer and placed something in his palm. It was the old and NBSP chip he gave her as a child. Cleaned and still functional. "I never threw it away," she said. "You promised to." Answer. Mark felt his throat tighten. "I always meant to," he said. "Glad you remembered." She nodded, then turned. Voice sharp again. "Team, move out." Mark watched them disappear into the shadows of the mountain. Time moved slowly in the silence of the cockpit. He kept his hands on the controls, eyes on the monitors, heart pounding. Minutes passed, then alarms flashed red. "They've been spotted," he whispered, scanning the feed. Enemy drones launched from the west ridge, flying directly toward the base. Mark gritted his teeth, fingers twitching above the weapon system toggle. He wasn't supposed to engage, but he wouldn't let them die. He activated the decoy flares and launched a sonic pulse toward the drones. They scattered briefly, buying Jerry's team a few seconds. Over the comm, her voice came through, strained but clear. "We're inside. Detonator is placed. 5 minutes." "Copy," Mark said, sweat dripping from his brow. He looked at the countdown. Each second a hammer in his chest. Then a new signal flashed. "Enemy interceptors inbound. Too fast, too many, too close." He slammed the thrusters too full, lifting the ship just enough to draw fire. The sky lit up as plasma bolts chased his trail. He danced through them like an old magician, sparks flying around him. He pulled up hard, dragging the fight away from the mountain. Then her voice came again. "Detonators live. Pulling out now. Exit point, East Ridge." 2 minutes. On it, Mark said, flipping the ship midair toward the extraction zone. Through the smoke and blinding flashes, he saw them running. Jerry was at the front, her arm bleeding, her steps unshaken. The rear soldier fell, but she didn't stop. Mark opened the cargo ramp and screamed into the comm. "Jump!" Now they leaped, landing hard inside the ship as Mark pulled them up into the sky. Behind them, the mountain erupted, fire tearing through rock and steel. The weapon was gone, but the cost wasn't clear yet. Mark looked back, blood staining the floor. Team members injured, gasping, and Jerry leaning against the wall, breathing hard. Eyes locked on him. "You came," she said, voice cracking. "Always," he replied, without hesitation. And in that burning sky, something changed between them forever. The battle for her people, the Iron Hope, flew fast and low across the dying sky. Smoke chased them from the burning mountain, glowing red like the final breath of a giant. Inside the ship, Mark kept one hand on the throttle, the other wiping blood off his console. The crew groaned behind him, wounded but alive. Jerry sat near the ramp, armor cracked, her left arm wrapped in a torn field dressing. Her breathing was rough, but her eyes were clear, focused. Explosion had destroyed the weapon site, but the real battle was just beginning. They had poked a monster, and now it was fully awake. Enemy ships began to swarm from orbit, drawn by the massive energy signature. Mark gritted his teeth, guiding the ship through narrow canyons We're not going to outrun them like this, he said. Jerry pushed herself to her feet, leaning against the wall for balance. There's an old base, she said, hidden under a salt ridge south of the river. Trench, Mark nodded, already rerouting. Blaster fire lit the sky behind them, shaking the hall as they dove into the shadows. He flipped a switch, activating stealth plating and heat dispersion. The Iron Hope vanished into the terrain like a ghost. They touched down in silence, surrounded by cliffs and mist. Jerry's squad began tending to the wounded while Mark secured the entrance to the hidden outpost. It was small, dusty, and cold, but it was shelter inside. Jerry collapsed into a chair, finally letting herself breathe. Mark knelt beside her and checked her arm. Carefully, you should rest, he said. But she shook her head. No time, she replied. They'll strike the rebel cities next. Mark stared at her, confused. But we just destroyed the weapon, he said. Jerry pulled out a small device from her chest pouch. This wasn't the only key, she said. This was the target code. They had the launcher elsewhere. Silence filled the room. Mark leaned back, hands on his knees. So we stopped part of it, he said, but the killing blow is still coming. Jerry nodded. And my people won't survive without help. She stood slowly and walked toward the map table inside the outpost. Glowing dots lit up as she tapped locations. These cities where the old resistance still hides are marked for destruction. Mark looked at the screen and saw names he had heard in refugee whispers. These aren't military targets, he said. These are homes. Jerry's voice cracked. My home. He looked at her, seeing the weight she carried. A girl who had once begged for shelter now stood between survival and extinction. What do you want from me, Jerry? He asked gently. She looked up at him, eyes burning with something between fear and hope. I want you to lead the evac mission, she said. You're the only one who knows how to move people without being seen. Mark blinked, surprised. I'm just a pilot, he said. She stepped forward. You're more than that. You've saved thousands. He looked away, trying to hide the emotions building behind his eyes. Jerry touched his shoulder and whispered, you saved me. That moment shattered something inside him, the memory of the scared girl in the cargo hold, the one who trusted him when she had nothing. He turned back to the map, jaw clenched. Then let's get your people out, he said. Every single one of them. The next few days were a blur of speed, danger, and fire. Mark led a fleet of disguised freighters through dead zones and hidden jump points. Jerry's rebels worked groundside, gathering families, elders, and children into safe zones. Laser fire rained from the skies, but they kept moving. During one drop, Mark landed in the heart of a collapsing city. The smell of smoke and blood was everywhere. He found a girl clutching a baby, both covered in dust. He lifted them into his arms and ran toward the ramp as debris fell behind him. Jerry met him at the top, covering his retreat with a blaster rifle. They barely made it out, the city crumbling into flames. Behind them on the ship, the girl looked up at Jerry and whispered, are we safe now? Jerry knelt down and smiled. Yes, because someone came back for you. After the final wave of evacuations, the remaining rebel fighters stood on the surface. Mark and Jerry watched the last freighter rise into orbit, heavy with the last survivors. She looked at him and whispered, you gave them a future. He looked at her and said, so did you. For a moment there was only silence. between them. Then Jerry leaned closer and asked softly, "Do you see me as an adult now?" Mark smiled and replied, "I always did, I just didn't want to believe how fast time moves." And in that stillness, as the fires of war faded behind them, something unspoken passed between their hearts. Not just a bond of survival, but a connection that could no longer be denied. The return to Earth, the iron hope broke through Earth's atmosphere as dawn lit up the clouds. The blue planet looked peaceful from space, calm and untouched by the war they had left behind. Inside the ship, silence filled the cockpit, not from fear but from something heavier, a feeling that everything was about to change. Mark Holly sat at the controls, eyes fixed on the Earth below. His hands moved from habit, steady and practiced, but inside he was tired, not from battle, but from carrying too many memories. Jerry stood behind him, her gaze locked on the familiar world. She had seen Earth once before from the window of a refugee station. Now she was returning, not as a lost girl, but as a survivor of war, a commander. Yet in her heart she wondered if she still belonged here, if this place could accept who she had become. The ship landed near the city edge, far from the crowds. Jerry Snorts stepped out into the open air, the breeze brushing her skin gently. It smelled of wet soil and fresh leaves, scent she had never known but somehow longed for. Mark walked beside her in silence, letting her take it in. Government officials met them with formal greetings and polite nods, but they didn't understand what it meant to walk away from fire, carrying lives on your back. Mark handed them data chips with evacuation logs. Jerry handed them medical scans and rebel intelligence. They were thanked, awarded, and promised honors, but neither of them cared about medals or speeches. They only wanted peace and maybe something more, something still unspoken. Mark brought her to his small house near the forest edge. It was quiet, simple, and filled with tools, books, and pieces of old machines. Jerry wandered through the room's fingers brushing across pictures, shelves, and half-finished projects. "You live here?" she asked gently. He nodded. "Where else would I go?" She smiled. "You always liked fixing things." He chuckled, still trying to fix myself too. Jerry didn't reply, but her eyes said she understood. That night the fire crackled in the hearth, while wind moved softly through the trees. Mark sat on the porch playing an old guitar, notes drifting into the dark. Jerry stepped out, wrapped in a borrowed coat, her steps quiet. She listened, without speaking, just letting the sound fill the silence. "You remember music?" Mark asked. She nodded. "I used to dream about it." He strummed another chord. "Funny how we dream of things we've never known." She looked up at the stars and whispered, "I used to dream of you too." Mark stopped playing, his fingers resting on the strings. He turned to her, heart beating like it hadn't in years. "Snorts." Jerry stepped closer, her voice soft. "You said I was grown already back then, I remember," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "But I wasn't," she continued. "I didn't know what I wanted, not really." Mark waited, letting her finish at her own pace. "But I do now," she said, her eyes meeting his, clear and certain. He stood slowly, standing across from her in the quiet night. "You came back," he said. "I kept my promise," she replied, "and now I want to stay." The wind moved through the trees, but neither of them noticed. He stepped forward and gently touched her hand. It was warm, steady, and no longer trembling like before. No longer A child's hand, but one that had fought. Survived and chosen. I never stopped. Waiting, he said, even when I told myself I had. Jiri leaned her head against his chest. The stars watched in silence, 2 lives separated by war, and time had finally returned to the same point, not as captain and stowaway, not as soldier and pilot, but as something new. The next morning Mark took her into town. People stared, curious but not cruel. Jiri walked beside him with her head high, her scars uncovered. She wasn't hiding anymore. Children pointed at her markings and whispered. One little girl approached her and asked, "Are you a hero?" Jiri knelt down and smiled. "No," she said, "but I followed one." Mark smiled from a distance, watching her speak with kindness and calm. She wasn't just visiting Earth, she was becoming part of it, and maybe, just maybe, Earth was ready for her too. As evening fell, she turned to him and whispered, "Thank you for not forgetting me." He touched her cheek and said, "You made sure I never could." And as the sky darkened into night, one truth became clear to both of them. Some promises outlive war. Some connections don't fade with time, and some stories don't end. They just begin again. A promise fulfilled. Morning light streamed through the window of the little house at the forest's edge. Birds sang softly in the trees, and the scent of dew mixed with fresh soil in the air. Jiri stood barefoot in the garden, letting the wind play with her hair. Her scars caught the sunlight, no longer something to hide, but something that told her story. Inside, Mark brewed tea while tuning the radio on the kitchen counter. The world had gone quiet again, but not because there was no danger. It was quiet because people were rebuilding. It was quiet because the war was finally over. Jiri stepped inside, holding a small flower between her fingers. "It's the first one I've seen bloom here," she said softly. Mark took it from her and placed it in a glass on the table. "Then it's yours," he said. Just like this day, they sat across from each other, eating simple food. No battle alarms, no starships roaring overhead, no cries for help, just 2 souls finally resting and learning what peace really felt like. Jiri helped in the village nearby. She taught young aliens and human children how to read old star maps. She spoke about unity, survival, and the quiet power of kindness. People listened because her voice carried truth, not just words. Mark spent his time fixing old machines and building new tools for farmers. He worked with grease on his hands and music in his ears. At night he shared stories with Jiri, laughing about the times he almost crashed into moons, and sometimes they just sat in silence, because not every moment needed noise. One evening, while stars blinked softly above, Jiri found an old coat in the storage room. It was the same oversized jacket she wore when she first stowed away in his ship. She held it up, smiling. "It still smells like oil and protein bars," she joked. Mark looked at her and chuckled. "That thing kept you alive," she nodded, pressing it to her chest. "And you did too," she said quietly. Then she folded it and placed it back, not to wear again, but to remember as days turned into weeks. Something gentle grew between them. It was not sudden, not loud. It was steady, like river water. Jiri would rest her head on Mark's shoulder during quiet moments, and he would hold her hand when words were too much. People around them started to whisper, but not with fear. They whispered with wonder at how human and a Zakiri could find peace in each No one mocked, no one pushed away. Because they had both bled for this. Peace and people respected that. One afternoon, as Mark was fixing a broken water pump, Jiri came to him with a small metal case. He looked up, wiping sweat from his brow. "What's that?" he asked. She opened it, revealing a pendant inside shaped like two hands, holding a star, in scary tradition. She said, "This means bond beyond war." Mark touched it gently, his hands rough. "But careful, it's beautiful," he said. "But what does it mean for us?" Jiri smiled, her eyes glowing softly. "It means I choose you," she said, "not because I owe you, not because you saved me, but because I want to." Mark stood, slowly, heart full and eyes misty. "I never thought this would happen," he said. "Not like this." Jiri stepped closer. "You waited," he nodded. "Every year." She placed a pendant around his neck and kissed his cheek, and the air felt warmer even in the wind, because something sacred had just been spoken. Without needing more words, that night, they stood beneath the stars, side by side. The galaxy was still wild, still dangerous, still full of unknowns, but here in this small place on Earth, two lives had found balance, a pilot and a stowaway, a soldier and a dreamer. Jiri looked up and whispered, "I told you I'd come back when I was grown." Mark smiled, placing his arm around her. "And I promised I'd be here," he replied, and both promises were now complete. Together, they looked to the sky, not with fear but with hope, for tomorrow, for peace, for something they would build, not from war or survival, but from trust, from love. And in that quiet moment, the stars above them blinked like witnesses. A girl who had once whispered, "I'm practically an adult," had returned as a woman who knew exactly who she was, and the man who once gave her shelter had now given her a home. Their story didn't end with war or rescue, it ended with choice, with peace, with a promise fulfilled.